Hello and welcome to episode 107 of the Alfa Romeo Driver Podcast, brought to you by the Alfa Romeo Owners Club. With me this afternoon, I have Alfa Hillclimber, National Alfa Day pace car driver, and friend of the podcast Mike Stark, and former club chairman and Alfa Romeo Driver Editor Ed McDonough. Good afternoon, gentlemen.
Good afternoon, Guy.
Hello, Guy.
We're here to talk about an Alfa, arguably a very important, if not one of the most important Alfas certainly in the UK's history, and one that almost nobody knew anything about until very recently. Mike, do you want to start the story off?
Yeah, sure. I guess to give a bit of background to how we came across what we came across is to link it to the work we've been doing with regards to Aston Hill. And for those people listening who don't know about Aston Hill, it's an old hill climb in the eastern part of Buckinghamshire, just outside the village of Aston Clinton. And I live in the village of Aston Clinton, and I'm also a keen hill climber. So I've always had a bit of a fascination with Aston Hill and its history. But only about 3 years ago did I have the time to start researching the history of the hill in more detail, with a view to organising something in 2025 to celebrate the centenary of the last event to be held at Aston Hill. Because as people may know, open road motorsport that existed in the very early pioneering years, should I say, of the sport, came to an end in 1925 when it was banned. And Aston Hill was amongst those hills that are no longer able to host events following that ban. So with a view to holding something in 2025 to celebrate that fact, myself and a friend of mine called Steve Akers, were researching the history of the hill. At the time, not really with a view to doing much with it other than sort of sharing some of that history. We've ended up writing a book about the history of Aston Hill, but that wasn't the original intent. But when we found out as much as we found out, we decided to write a book. And our research took us to various libraries, archives, and other interesting places. And it was while we were at the VSCC library, during one of the first days, actually, when we were doing our research, that we discovered a reference to an Alfa, and that's all it said, just an Alfa, competing in Class 4 at an event at Aston Hill in June 1912, the precise date being the 8th of June 1912. And that was in the Motor Journal, published the following week for the event. I'm certainly no expert on early Alfas, but obviously I know Ed well, and I know that he is. So I sort of mentioned it to Ed, and I'm sure Ed can come in a second, and was unaware, I think, of an Alfa being in the UK prior to the First World War. Obviously, with the company only starting in 1910, there was no apparent record of there being an Alfa in the UK that early. And then, keen to sort of find out more, a few months later, we were down at the National Motor Museum library in Bewley, and we found a period copy of the Autocar published on the 15th of June 1912, so about a week after the event we're talking about. And fortunately, they had the results published for the event, and we could see in the results an Alfa 24 horsepower listed, finishing 5th in the class, driven by somebody called G. Vidler. For me, that sort of clarified it must have been an Alfa. I was aware by then, following discussions with Ed, that the only Alfa available at the time was the 24
hence
model.
An Alfa, because that covered all available options at that point.
Absolutely. And to be honest, even when I saw the first reference, the one I mentioned a while ago in the Motor, I thought, perhaps there was another car make with an acronym ALFA that perhaps people don't know about and didn't survive or didn't exist for very long, because back then there were so many makes of cars. I mean, more than 170 makes of cars competed at Aston Hill, for example. And obviously some of them are very well known and have lasted a long time, like Aston Martin and Bentley, but most of them have long gone. So I wasn't even sure it was an Alfa, if you see what I mean. But obviously the Autocar results clearly showed it was, bearing in mind that the reference to it being the 24 model. So at that point, I got Ed more involved in trying to find a bit more about it, whilst at the same time I was on the hunt for a picture, which fortunately we did manage to stumble across a little bit later. It's not a picture of the car on its own competing at Aston Hill. It's actually a lineup of cars prior to the start, and one of them is the Alfa, and so that was good to dig that out. So, Ed, I'll bring you in at that stage because I think you can probably fill in some of the blanks then.
Yeah, well, it's a really interesting story. And one of my old quiz questions in our Alfa Club section was, is Alfa Romeo a French company or an Italian company? In fact, I would say it's both. What happened, one, it was interesting when we discovered there had been an Alfa in 1912. And the other thing that caught my attention was that George Vidler, also drove in that event a Dirac. And that was a really interesting connection and got me asking around, did anybody know about this? And, people like Carol Corliss, people who knew a lot about pre-war cars, nobody really knew anything about the origins, although there was a reference in the Hull and Slater Alfa book. And what happened was that in 1909, Ugo Stella, who was the managing director of the Italian factory for Dirac in Milan, stole Morosi as an engineer from the company Bianchi and commissioned him to build a new performance model car that would be good for touring and competition, which was getting very popular on the continent. But that was in 1909. By the time Morosi got around to doing this, the Dirac company and the factory, which was at Portello in Milan, had really gone out of business and was taken over by another group who in 1910 named themselves Anonima Lombarda Fabbrica Automobili, or Alfa. And Morosi had designed a car which was known as the 24 HP, 24 horsepower car, emerged in, the design ended in 1909, early 1910. And the 24 HP was received very well in those days and made its first appearance in 1911 in the Targa Florio. It was very impressive. And then the history about the export of these cars got quite mysterious, and there's no records kept of what happened to these cars. Over the period that the 24 HP was made, for about 3 years, they built about 600 cars, very few of which remain. But of course, in looking into this, when we finally realized that this car had run at Aston Hill, we also discovered that the 24 HP in the Alfa Museum at Arese had a British registration. And Mike and Steve tracked this down, and the registration was an early South London registration on the car in the museum. Well, who had a Dirac agency in South London? George Vidler. So it really got us thinking. Vidler was in a Dirac and an Alfa at Aston Hill in 1912, and there in the museum is a British registered 24 HP. And really that set me off and trying to determine whether this car in the museum was the George Vidler car. Sadly, it's been very hard getting information back from Arese on this, and we've yet to confirm it. And we're still chasing it and still have some hopes that we might get that car over May the 17th for the centenary. I don't know that we will, but I also discovered that in the Hull and Slater book that they had confirmed that this was the very first Alfa that took part in competition and one of the first cars exported to the UK. I think there were probably 2 cars that came to the UK. Only one of which was known to have taken place in competition by Hull and Slater. So it makes it a really very, very interesting car and a mystery we're still trying to solve.
And we don't know the route in for the other car. We don't know whether they both came in through Vidler or...
No, we did. There are no records. There are no records of that, and that's really hard to confirm. And really, very little is known about the pre-1920 Alfas that came into the UK.
And the museum in Arese is spectacularly good on documentation in some areas, and less good in other areas. And that's not all history, as I found out trying to write a book about the Brera. But it's not terribly surprising that they don't necessarily know the provenance of of a car in their collection, is it?
Well, I don't think they kept records back that early. And when Peter Collins and I were writing our Tipa 33 book, we said to the people who were in the museum when we were over looking at some of the cars, we said to them, we said, we have something to tell you about this car. And they all sort of looked very worried. And we said, this is a genuine car. And that was a surprise to them.
So I assume the photo of the car lined up, there's either not a number plate on it or we can't see it. So we can't confirm the...
Yeah.
But this, I don't know if you can see this.
Well, we won't be able to on the podcast, Ed, because it's audio only.
I'll show you. There is a picture from the Fusi book of that car, the museum car, with that early registration.
But the Aston Hill picture you're talking about, Guy, that's the one that was published in Alfa Romeo Driver in Ed's article a few issues ago. For those still with a copy, it's on page 63 of the issue. It was the October 24 issue. October 2024 issue. If you look on page 63, there's the photo from the car journal. It was again. That was another one we managed to track down at the National Motor Museum Library in Bewley. It's the fifth car from the left is the Alfa, but unfortunately it's sort of partly obscured by another car. So we can't see the registration or the competition number on it. And obviously if the registration was on it, we could have then compared it to the other photos that Ed has of the car and then confirm to some extent, I mean, it might not be 100% confirmation, but certainly to a large extent, confirm if it's the same car. But unfortunately, that part of the car from the Aston Hill picture is obscured. But I guess, there's probably a pretty strong likelihood it is. The other channel we went down, as well as Ed looking into the history of the car, was trying to find out more about George Vidler, because we thought if we could find out more about Mr. Vidler, we might be able to find out more about the car and what happened to it, why it came here, where it went, etc., etc. And whilst we did find out quite a bit more about George Vidler, there was no other Alfa history or information. We discovered that he raced a Dirac at Brooklands a few times. We discovered through a rather tenuous route of the Rolls-Royce Owners Club in Australia a bit more about him because his son Jack moved to Australia with Rolls-Royce and became quite a prominent figure in the Rolls-Royce community over there. And there was a few Rolls-Royce publications that were published when George Vidler passed away, not only passing on their sympathies to his son Jack, but also giving a bit of information about George Vidler and his history. And then Jack's son Roger, who was George Vidler's grandson, also wrote a short book/essay about his father and his grandfather. Again, that gave a little bit more information about George's history, but there's no mention of any other Alfa. So really there's a lot of Dirac mentions and a lot of Rolls-Royce mentions, but nothing else about Alfa. So all we really have is the fact that he competed at Aston Hill in both an Alfa and a Dirac in June 1912.
And the obvious links between Dirac and Alfa.
And the obvious links between the two, but we have no record of him competing elsewhere in an Alfa. As I say, we do have him competing at Brooklands in a Dirac. It's not to say he didn't, but there's no record that we could find.
So where we'd like to take this story next, Ed? So the museum don't have great records of the period. I guess there's a slim chance that somebody listening to this podcast might know something that we haven't found out yet. What clues are we looking for?
Any. But I've just put a notice on the Facebook group, which is the group for the Alfa Romeo Museum, sort of saying, explaining this quandary and asking if anybody has any information or has a connection. And I'm about to resend my article from Alfa Romeo Driver to the museum to see if I can prompt them. There must be somebody at the museum who has some grasp of the history of that particular car. They've had it in their possession for quite a long time. And if they can put a message out to their, the Italian contacts, Alfa contacts, of which there are many knowledgeable people, we might come up with something.
Yeah, I mean, even if they don't have records of it coming to the UK, there must be some record of the museum buying it. I mean, the first time I went to the museum was about 2003, I think, and I have a picture from it then. So it's been there for at least 25 years.
Yes,
presumably quite a bit. Quite a bit longer than that. So you would think at some point somebody handed over some money to somebody, or took legal ownership of a donation or something. There must be some record of how it got there.
Or possibly that was a car that didn't stay very long in the UK and went back to Alfa in period.
Yeah, I guess so. But you would have thought that either it would have been re-registered with Italian plates on it, and therefore somebody has consciously put British plates back on it because they've got a historic link to it.
Yeah.
Or it literally sat in a storeroom in Portello and was then moved to a racy and has had UK plates on it ever since. But yeah, it's a fascinating missing.
I know there's some very knowledgeable Dirac people around, and we've asked the Dirac club or the club that has Dirac in its membership as well. They've got anything on it, and I know we had a Dirac at an Alfa club meeting some years ago, and there were some very knowledgeable Dirac people, but we've not heard back on that either.
Guy, from my perspective, I'm optimistic, might be too strong a word, hopeful perhaps is a better word, that somebody might come forward with some information more related to Aston Hill, but that might have something about the Alfa in it. Because one thing that has been extremely pleasing, I guess, and rewarding is that since we published the Aston Hill book a couple of months ago, I've had a number of people contact me with additional information about Aston Hill. People coming forward saying, oh, my great-grandfather or my grandfather competed there, or I've got a photo of this. Last week, somebody contacted me because they actually had a winner's medal, somebody who won a motorcycle hill climb at Aston Hill and had a winner's medal in his possession for many, many years. He bought off eBay a long time ago. So what's really rewarding, as I say, and pleasing is that people are coming forward now that there's a book about Aston Hill, and now that they know there's an event coming up about it to celebrate that history with information. So I'm hopeful that perhaps someone's got a photo somewhere tucked away in a drawer that's been handed down through generations or whatever that might be a better photo of the car. And if it's got the registration number or some more detail on it, we can actually go a bit further in terms of identifying that it's the right car.
Mike's an optimist, and I'm his other half. And I'm a pessimist. And I know that information will come up. It'll be on May the 18th.
Well, that might just be in time for our June issue if I hold it back a little bit. But not in time for the hill climb, obviously. Yeah. There's something I'm going to pick up on in a moment, but our listeners won't know this, but Mike's been sitting there watching me looking at a different screen while I'm having a conversation with him, which is because I'm trying to look up something in the background that is relevant that I'll come back to in a minute. When you and I first talked about this event, Mike, you were asking if I was able to come along and take some photos. We were actually talking at the Cop Hill
That's right, yeah.
And you said, sadly that there won't be any Alfa involvement because there were no Alfas ever competed at the event. So obviously we've found out that that's not true. But if anybody does want to come along, I think there will be some Alfas at the anniversary event.
Yeah. That's right, yeah. So the Aston Hill Centenary event is taking place in May of this year. The reason for the date, if I can just take a moment to explain that, is although the last event held at Aston Hill in period was on the 28th of February 1925, during our research we discovered that an event had been scheduled and approved for the 16th of May 1925. It was the annual open hill climb run by the Herts County Auto and Aero Club, but obviously it never went ahead because following an accident at Cop Hill in the March, all permits for open road motorsport were withdrawn in the April of 1925, and so the event at Aston Hill in May never went ahead. So that's why we're holding the centenary event on the anniversary, or 100 years and a day since the event that never took place, just in order to, if you like, recognise that fact, and for just a slightly amusing reason, because Motorsport UK are going to issue us a permit saying it's the same event but 100 years late, which clearly it's not, but it's a bit of PR anyway. So that's why the event's taking place then. There's several elements to the event. There's an exhibition about the history of Aston Hill that's taking place in the pavilion in Aston Clinton Park in the days prior to the actual show. And then on the day itself, on Saturday the 17th of May, there's a big show taking place in two large fields at the top of Aston Hill, the highlight of which is a parade of period vehicles. We've got currently 80 pre-1926 cars and motorcycles entered for a parade through the village of Aston Clinton and up Aston Hill. They'll be setting off at 1 minute intervals because the road will remain open and we don't want to get too bogged down in local traffic. So the road will remain open and the cars will be setting off at 1 minute intervals. We have a fabulous collection of 100-year-old plus cars and motorcycles participating, including 5 cars that actually competed at Aston Hill in period, and all the others being of the type type that did so. We've been working very closely with the Vintage Sports Car Club to identify cars, or should I say owners of cars that of the type that competed. And they've done a tremendous job getting them to enter the parade. That's taking place on the day. In terms of the show, we've had an amazing response, totally blown away by the level of interest. We were, about 6 months ago, we were worried whether anybody would come. We've been totally overwhelmed in a very positive way with the interest. All the display tickets, so those are for people who've got pre-1980 cars and motorcycles to go into the show field to display their vehicles. All 450 display tickets have been sold, and the visitor tickets, of which there's 750 on sale, we've sold, I think, about 450 to 500 of those already, and they're selling at a rapid rate of knots. So if anybody does want to come along, then they're very welcome to do so. Obviously, they do need to get their skates on in terms of obtaining a visitor ticket. The visitor parking is in the field right next to the show, so it's very, very convenient. But to get one, as I say, you will need to get a move on because they are going to sell out probably by the 2nd or 3rd week of April. If they go to AstonHill100.com, there's a link there to the ticket site, or via the Facebook page, there's also a link there as well. And the local AROC section have got a display area for some classic Alfas in the show as well. So there will be an Alfa display as part of the show. And as you referenced our conversation from Cop Hill a few years ago, when I wrongly said that there was no Alfa competed at Aston Hill, obviously it was much to my delight that I find that
correctly based on the evidence available at the time.
The evidence at the time, yes, there was no record of it I'd come across at that point, but obviously, as I say, much to my excitement and interest, we discovered there was. And so now it's very appropriate, I think, to have some Alfas come along to celebrate the history of Aston Hill, and the fact that obviously it was the scene of the first competitive performance by an Alfa in this country.
So I've managed to find the document that I was looking for. So we've already referenced the Ed's article from October 2024, which people should go and have a look at. I've been looking for an article from October 2019 written by John Dooley, Ed. So if John Dooley, I think, had been at your section quiz when you asked whether Alfa was a French or an Italian company, I think John might have argued that it was British. So in the story that John wrote about the Portello factory, he talks about a lawyer who you may well be familiar with, John Smith Wimby, who worked with Dirac and was responsible for setting up, I think, the UK and Spanish subsidiaries of Dirac, and was then tangentially involved in setting up the Italian Dirac company, which became Alfa. But he was actually on the board of directors of Alfa when it formed. So there was a continuous British connection through the Dirac licensee and into the early days of Alfa as well.
Yeah, and of course Alfa Romeo, and when Nicola Romeo took over the company, Alfa Romeo there were very substantial connections between Alfa Romeo pre-war with the UK.
Yeah, well, and a number of UK providers of bodies for Alfa Romeo chassis, of course.
I also say that we would never have invited John Dooley to our quiz on
because he would have won. Yeah. Yeah. That was just, as we were having the conversation, I thought, I'm sure John talked about a British origin, and I wasn't imagining it.
No, I think you're absolutely right.
Cool.
All I want to say about the event on May 17th is that there are going to be some amazingly interesting early cars, very early cars at that event. We may or may not get the Alfa here, but some of the early cars are just staggeringly interesting and in good running condition. So the entry is really, really good.
And anything that's running is going to sound amazing too.
Oh, yeah.
I think the other thing to add is the greater understanding now that we're starting to see, and that will be shared even further during the exhibition in May and during the event itself, that the history of Aston Hill is a lot more than the history of Aston Martin. Mm. And, that's really what most people had known about for decades and decades and decades, because obviously Aston Hill has the fairly unique mark of giving its name to a make of car after Lionel Martin competed there in 1914 twice. And then when he made his first car in 1915, naming it Aston Martin after the Hill and himself. And there's a monument at the top by the finish line, which talks about that and, is known locally as the Aston Martin Monument. And, most people associate Aston Hill with Aston Martin. But I think during our research, what we discovered is the history of the Hill is so much more than that. And, we've spoken at length about the interesting Alfa connection and Alfa history. But if we take Bentley, for example, the first time W.O. Bentley ever competed in a car was at Aston Hill. Yeah. Coincidentally, that was also at the 8th of June 1912 meeting. And the photo we actually have that's published in the Alfa Romeo Driver from October last year on page 63, one of the other cars, the third one along from the left, is actually W.O. Bentley and his fiancée sitting in a DFP car just prior to him doing his first run at his first ever car event. He'd previously competed in motorcycles, including at Aston Hill, but this was the first time he ever competed in a car anywhere. So things like that make Aston Hill also very interesting from a Bentley history point of view, as well as from an Alfa point of view, as well as from Aston Martin. And many other notable and interesting pieces of history have come out from the research. For example, Raymond Mays, probably Britain's best known racing driver between the wars, and also the inaugural winner of the British Hillclimb Championship, the oldest motorsport championship in the world. The first time he ever competed in a car or ever competed in a motorsport event was at Aston Hill in 1921. It was the InterVarsity Hill Climb between Cambridge and Oxford. He was a young student at Cambridge. His father had just bought him a Hillman. He came to Aston Hill and was the fastest car there. So lots of interesting history that has come out. And I think Ed alluded to the wonderful gathering of period vehicles we're going to have taking part at the event in May. There's also an amazing collection of classic vehicles, classic cars and classic bikes coming. And I think it's very fitting that we've got such a great mix and collection of vehicles coming to celebrate that. Clearly, Aston Martin is a very important part of Aston Hill's history and vice versa. So I don't want to underplay the Aston Martin connection, but at the same time, the history of the Hill is a lot more than that. And, I'm delighted that the way the centenary event is shaping up for May is going to pay tribute to that. It's not just going to be a large gathering of Aston Martins. It's, in fact, we've got probably more Bentleys coming than we have Aston Martins already.
Certainly one of my takeaways from this conversation is that if any Aston Martin owner ever brings up the links with the Aston Hillclimb, I shall point out that the Alfa Romeo history goes back further than the Aston Martin
absolutely,
history.
yeah. I mean, absolutely.
It may have ended before the Aston Martin one started, but that's not.
Yeah.
There are also a number of interesting people, descendants of some of the competitors from the period, and people connected to them, and as well as Nick Mason's been very supportive of the project and of Mike and Steve's book. He's sending a couple of Astons. We think they might actually end up as course cars. We're hoping that Nick himself will show up, and a number of other interesting people. And we've met some extraordinary people during the period of research, including Victor Riley, who is the son of Victor Riley, who was the founder of Riley Cars. And he's not very well, but we're sort of hoping he might be well enough to be there at the event.
Fantastic. So again, there are still some visitor tickets available, but by the time this podcast is broadcast, you're going to have to hurry if you want to get one of those before they all go.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there hopefully will still be some left for people who haven't got a ticket yet but want to come. And if you do go on to get a ticket and you get the message that they've all sold out, then if you're an Alfa Romeo Owners Club's member, then feel free to contact me and I'll do the best I possibly can. I can't guarantee I'll be able to find you a ticket, but I'll do my best to help if I can, and feel free to do that.
Thank you. I think that's a brilliant note to end on. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Ed.
Yep.
Thanks, Guy. Much appreciated.
That's it for this episode. We'll be back in 4 weeks' time on Sunday, the 4th of May, to celebrate our 5th anniversary. Episode 108 will be available to download from 1:30 p.m. from the club's website, Apple Podcasts, Podbean, Podcast Addict, YouTube, and everywhere else good podcasts are found. Until then, stay safe.